G'day everyone, RJ here with another episode of RJ's This Is Not Legal Advice, or TINLA for short, and nor is it. So this is a little message about abortions and, if you want to call it, abortion rights or the right to life or whatever in the USA. So some of you may know, even though it hasn't been well reported in the media, even though it should have been everywhere, that a few days ago, maybe a week ago or something like that, that there was an assassin caught out the front of the US Supreme Court Judge Brett Kavanaugh's house with weapons and was going to murder that, justice. For my Australian audience, that's the US equivalent of the High Court, and they have 9 justices of the Supreme Court in the USA, and Australia, for comparison, has 7 High Court judges at the moment, even though really it should be more based on caseloads and whatever, but that's another topic. So we've just had a ruling by the US Supreme Court, which overturned a famous case about abortions or abortion rights in the USA called Roe versus Wade. So that was from 1973, and I haven't looked into all the details, like, transcripts or full judgments or anything like that. But a summary is, with the US, with their Bill of Rights, all their amendments are basically called the Bill of Rights, the amendments to their federal constitution, that is. And the 14th Bill of Rights includes about privacy. So in 1973, there was a pregnant woman, who was trying to fight for her right to kill her baby. The case took a long time and the baby was actually born, thankfully for that baby, obviously. I haven't looked up if that baby, when she's grown up, is a pro-abortion activist or an anti-abortion activist. I imagine should be anti-abortion, unless she is depressed or hates herself or something. But you get the idea. So in 1973, the US Supreme Court ruled that there was a constitutional right to abortion for women, obviously, because it's not, in the favor of the unborn child. But what that did was meant that it couldn't be state by state based, the abortion law. So a state couldn't vote to ban abortion, basically, but now they can again because it's been overturned. The court, the figures were 6 in favor of overturning that decision and 3 against overturning that decision, but now it's been done. So basically, there is no longer deemed a right to abort a child. I guess it's really going back to the originalism of the US Constitution, the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, with life being the first one. So the premier or most important one. So now the US, it's predicted that half the states will ban abortion, but people should remember that nowadays that isn't so much of a problem. People have transport, usually, even though the US public transport system sucks. If you watch a movie, Who Framed Roger Rabbit, that is actually explaining what happened, even though it sounds a bit funny, a movie explaining what happened. But basically, you had the US car companies who bought up all the rail lines and then tore them up. So there are some areas where you would have good public transport, such as, say, if you're in New York City and you're trying to get to New York City, but that's not the same thing as trying to get anywhere else. I have been on US public transport. Well, actually, technically it was private transport, but because there was a lack of public transport, where I landed in New York and had to get to Arkansas, but I ended up going to Memphis and then being picked up from there. So that was in a Greyhound bus. So coaches in Australia are like a big fancy thing, but in America, their Greyhound service is sort of like Gangsterville. And that'll be another story. So just so people are aware, in Australia, every year on average, approximately, there's 100,000 abortions, and the latest figures are there was 80,000. The numbers were actually going down, same as in the USA. In the USA, there's 2 sort of semi-official sources of the legal abortion numbers, which range from saying about 600,000 to 950,000 per year. Again, the US has gone down. They had a peak in 1990 of 1.6 million abortions, but if you take it as a rough estimate, from 1973 until now, 49 years, let's call it 50 years, then there were 50 million US children aborted. And then obviously they wouldn't have their children either, because, their life was snuffed out. And of course, there'll be a lot of people saying, my body, my choice, but, your one's body does not include someone else's body. And also, with the right to privacy, in a way, it's very silly describing it as a right to privacy, because why can't murderers, and unfortunately I've known some murderers, I also knew another murderer who seemed like a nice person. But anyway, the point is, why don't murderers have the right to their privacy and therefore not being prosecuted for murder, etc.? And I'm not saying that should be the case, but I'm just showing how ridiculous it is calling it a right to privacy, equating to the right to abort one's child. And a lot of you might know of the concept of judicial activism, which is basically the judges are biased and they want the law to say something which clearly it doesn't, even though the job of a judge is to interpret the law as to what it actually is. But then they will manipulate or bend or whatever you want to call it, the law, to enable them to make new laws that aren't supposed to be laws. The legislative branch is supposed to make the laws as a general concept. You also have executive powers, etc. But there are judge-made laws. Some are legitimate and some are not. So I'll do another video on that one day about a Australian court case, Markeet, I think it is, against the Attorney General of Western Australia, or maybe the names are reversed, and that was about 2003. But that was an interesting case of judicial activism from 6 of the 7 judges, with Kirby dissenting, and concerning the Australia Acts of 1986. But anyway, it's an interesting time, and we'll see what happens. Other people may also argue that with the US expected to be in war soon with, potentially Russia, China, etc., that it's a good time for more babies to be born. We also have a case of basically, the world's economies, in the West at least, have been completely destroyed and shut down for the purpose of saving a few people's lives in terms of the coronavirus, COVID-19, in that, it would be helpful if the statistics weren't people who died with COVID, but died from COVID, but you get the point. But why don't they do the same thing for protecting 50 million US citizens and, the millions of Australians aborted in that time period as well? And of course, going back to the individual states in the USA, of course, they would have exceptions to the rule for medically necessary and for basically, what's a nice way of putting it? Rape babies or whatever. But anyway, I better go. I'm trying to keep these videos under 10 minutes long now to see if people prefer a shorter format, even though they're going to be less detailed. But I may as well just speed this video up in post-production, because I will just point out that in Australia, there are babies that are allowed to be killed right up until they're fully born. And it is like that in some US states, even though it is not lawful, but, chopping a baby's head open when it's protruding from the lady bits and then sucking the brains out, etc. It's a very horrid thing in my opinion, but, people are entitled to different opinions. Also, with the medical necessity, again, there's sort of doctor activism instead of judicial activism, where doctors will just say, well, the mother wants it to be aborted, their child, so that is medically necessary because she might otherwise feel sad or something like that, so we'll do it, as opposed to it being, the mother's bleeding to death because the child is half attached to the womb or something like that, or, for whatever other reason, the baby's actually dying in the mother and has to be removed to prevent the likely outcome of the baby's decaying body being toxic to the mother. Might not be likely, but it's, it does have a chance of happening. There are some people that, have had babies stuck in them in ectopic pregnancies, where the baby's starting to be formed in the fallopian tubes and then stuck there for 30 years and then calcifies and whatever, but that's another story. Anyway, please like, share, and subscribe. You don't have to agree with my opinions, I don't have to agree with yours, but it is important to learn from each other and to respect each other. So I respect your opinion, and hopefully you respect mine as well. Anyway, have a lovely day. Bye. I will quickly add that besides there's an anti-human agenda to abortion laws, and also that a lot of people are more carefree than they used to be in the past in terms of, Tinder or something, having hundreds of sexual partners, that kind of thing. But if it is the Democrat states that continue to have abortions and the Republican states that ban abortions, then what's that going to mean in 20 years' time, assuming that Joe Biden doesn't just, increase the number of Supreme Court justices and then get the overturning of Roe against Wade reversed, essentially. But, if there's a lot more people being brought up in Republican environments, then there'll be a lot more Republican voters, unless, again, it just comes down to immigration, where immigrants usually vote left. So that's why the left loves immigrants, basically, from non-alike places, if that makes sense. So, if they're immigrants from the UK to the USA, then, it might be 50-50 voting left or right. But if they're from a different cultural background, then usually the first generation votes for the left. And we do find over time that as there's more and more generations, they tend to vote less and less to the left-wing parties, putting it nicely. Anyway, cheerio.